As always, Matilda Garrett sat in the booth in the farthest corner of the bar, trying to draw as little attention to herself as possible. And, as always, she could still hear the people whispering as they were hunched over the bar itself, and she could see them as they occasionally glanced over in her direction. She caught her name being said a few times. She managed to shrug it off for a while. As the minutes continued to pass and the conversation continued, though, she felt the irritation rising up in her. Eventually, she couldn't contain it anymore, and she flashed them an angry glare. They all looked away, and for at least a short while, she was left to drink in peace once again. The bartender, Sal, gave her a sympathetic look. She pretended like she didn't see it. His sympathy and those assholes' morbid curiosity were just as bad as one another. She didn't want any of that. Hell, she didn't even want anyone to be thinking about her. Fuck every last one of them. She just wanted to be left alone. That hope was almost immediately dashed as a man slid into the other side of the booth across from her. Matilda squinted her eyes at him as she gave him a look that she hoped made it very clear that his presence was not wanted. She'd never seen the guy before, and she knew pretty much all the locals, so she guessed he was from out of town. He was in his late 30s at the oldest, bald but in that clean-shaven kind of way instead of naturally occurring. He was wearing a black button-up shirt and holding a beer in one hand. She had to admit he was kind of handsome. Not enough to make her consider letting him sit there, though. "That seat's taken," she said, frowning slightly as she heard how slurred her speech was. "Oh yeah?" the man answered as he set his beer down on the table. "Doesn't seem like it." "Well, it is." He raised an eyebrow. "Those guys over at the bar, they tell me you killed your husband." Matilda blinked at him, surprised by the stranger's bluntness, but not by the accusation. Her husband's death had been her own private, unique brand of the scarlet letter since he had passed away. It didn't matter that the doctors concluded that he died of an overdose. It didn't matter that the police cleared her of any wrongdoing. It wouldn't have mattered if the fucking mayor threw her a not guilty of murder parade, complete with bands and fireworks. People just weren't capable of believing that someone they thought they knew was a meth addict behind closed doors. She was in the process of coming up with a retort when the man held up one finger and took a drink from his beer. "Pretty obvious those guys are full of shit," he said as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. That made her pause. She was already off balance from the sheer audacity on display from the man across from her, and the matter-of-fact way he had switched gears only added to that. "You don't have that look that all killers have in their eyes," the man continued before she could say anything. "Most people don't know it's there, but it always is. So, yeah, to recap, those guys are full of shit." "You've had your fun," Matilda said as she finally found her voice. "You can leave me alone now." "Oh, I'm sorry." The man held out his hand. "I didn't introduce myself. My name is Walter." She looked down at the hand for a moment before shaking her head. "No offense, but I don't care. Please, just leave me alone." He regarded her for a moment. "You really want to be left alone?" "Yeah, I do." "Huh. See, that's strange for me to hear, because I'm pretty good at reading people, and you strike me as a person that's experienced way too much of being alone." Matilda shook her head, trying to hide that his assessment had hit a little too close to home. "You don't know me." "That's true, I don't know you. I don't know what you've gone through or what makes you tick. What I do know is what's written all over your face. I also know what those asshats at the bar are saying about you. It's obviously not the first time you've been the target of their comments, and yet you still come here to drink. All of that paints a pretty good picture." She remained silent. The whole situation was so surreal that she couldn't figure out what to make of it. "Being alone is the last thing that you need," Walter told her. What you need is to spend time with someone that not only won't judge you, but also knows a little something about being judged himself. And you're that person, Matilda replied, making it a statement instead of a question. Yeah, I am. He took another swig of his beer. I'll make you a deal. You give me 5 minutes of your time, and if you want me to leave after that, I'll go. I'll see myself out of the bar and waltz off into the night, never to be seen again. Come on, you're never going to get a better offer than that. She raised an eyebrow. 5 minutes? That's all you're looking for? 5 minutes. That's correct. And what will you be doing during this 5 minutes? He held up a hand. Nothing inappropriate. I'll buy you the next round of drinks, and what the hell? I'll tell you a story. What do you say? Despite herself, Matilda found that she was intrigued by this man. It wasn't just his obvious self-confidence. There was something else there, something that drew her in. Against her better judgment, she nodded once. Excellent, Walter said as he motioned towards the bartender. Let's get those drinks first before I start my 5 minutes. They waited in silence for a short time. When Sal came over with their drinks, a beer for Walter and a whiskey for Matilda, he glanced at both of them. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he thought better of it and left without a word. There we go, Walter said as he finished off his first beer and swapped it out for the new one. Now that we've got our refreshments, let's get down to story time with Walter. Feel free to start the clock anytime you like. Matilda watched him as he sat back in his seat and made himself comfortable. He seemed to be enjoying himself. He was certainly making her evening more interesting than she intended it to be. Have you ever heard of the Lodge? He asked. What, you mean those places that you stay at in the woods or whatever? She answered with a frown. Which one? That's Lodge with a capital L, he corrected. Confusing, I know. I would have gone with a more distinct name, but I wasn't involved with the naming process. Obviously you haven't heard of it. How about the Underlayers? The Endless Pillar? She stared at him blankly. Don't worry about it. Most people haven't. Luckily for you, they're all the same thing. Different names, but ultimately the same thing. This is a little complicated. I'll make it as simple as I can. Picture a fancy lodge in your head. Not one of the small ones, but a large, luxurious one. Everything made of dark, expensive wood, every amenity you can think of, the whole 9 yards. All right, Matilda said as she closed her eyes and formed the image in her mind. There's nothing else but that lodge, nothing else at all. The lodge is everything, and it contains everything inside its walls. It's also vast beyond anything we can comprehend. In fact, our universe, not just our world, but the entire universe, is contained within just one of its infinite rooms. That, in very simplified terms, is the Lodge. And who made this amazing universe-containing place? She asked dryly. A single being known as the Creator, something so far beyond our comprehension that we could never hope to know its thoughts. One thing that we do know about the Creator is that it's trying to create a perfect universe. No one knows what a perfect universe looks like to the Creator, but it's made it quite clear that perfection is its goal. Matilda leaned forward and opened her eyes. That implies that he hasn't found it yet, and that our own universe is somehow imperfect. Walter raised his beer in a salute. That is a very astute observation. It's also correct. Our universe has been deemed a failure by the being that created it. Ain't that a kick in the nuts? Since we didn't meet its lofty standards, the Creator closed and locked the lodge door to our universe and tossed away the key. Out of sight and out of mind. How many of these failed universes are there? Numbers don't really apply when they get that large. Going back to mental images, picture a lodge hallway with infinite doors running down an infinite length of hallway, and you start to get the idea. She raised an eyebrow. That's a very nihilistic way of looking at things. Probably the most nihilistic way, really. Infinite universes locked away and completely forgotten. There was just the hint of a smile at the edge of Walter's mouth. I didn't say that they're completely forgotten. I just said that the Creator no longer cares about them. There's something else inside the Lodge that cares about them very, very much. That sounds ominous. Something happened to the beyond ancient universes that were the first into the discard pile. They decayed and became corrupt, creating a darkness of immeasurable evil. That being, that force, somehow entered the Lodge and has been methodically working its way down the infinite hallway, breaking in doors to other universes and bringing ruin to them. It corrupts them totally before devouring them and taking them into itself. Does this mystery evil thing have a name? He took a drink. Not officially, no. What would something like that need with a name? Still, we mere mortals do love our names. We call it the Rot. There was something in the way that he said the name that sent a chill down Matilda's spine. At first she had thought that he was simply telling her a scary story, something that was more at home by a campfire than in a bar. Now, though, she wasn't so sure. He really seemed to believe what he was saying. Want to know the worst part? Walter asked. No, she admitted truthfully, but tell me anyway. Now, it's our universe's turn in the meat grinder. She shook her head. I have to admit, that's a hell of a story. Pretty creepy, too. You've had more than your 5 minutes, though, so I think it's time for you to move on. Walter nodded. Sure, absolutely. I'm a man of my word. Now, I'm going to go outside and get some fresh air. I'll be out there for about, 10 minutes or so. After that, I need to move on. Okay, I don't see why you're telling me this. The reason I'm telling you this is because what I just told you isn't some story that I pulled out of my ass. I just told you a truth that very, very few people in this world know. You don't believe me. You're the kind of person that needs to see things with their own eyes to accept them. Well, I have proof of what I've said, and for the next 10 minutes, I'll be around for you to see that proof. If it's not something that you're interested in, well, no hard feelings. I've got more than enough out of this evening simply by having a good drink with an intelligent and attractive woman. Good evening to you. Walter reached into his pocket and produced his wallet. He fished out a few bills and set them down on the table. It was enough to pay for both their drinks while also leaving a substantial tip. With a final nod, he slid out of the booth and headed out into the night. Matilda stared at him for a long while. She felt like she had just survived a whirlwind. He had come into her life out of nowhere and left just as quickly. That was a good thing, obviously. He was probably a creep working some angle that she wasn't seeing, or maybe he was just mental. Either way, she was glad to be rid of him. But still, his story kept running through her mind. The words were fantastical to the point of absurdity, but there was something in them that was now keeping them reverberating through her thoughts. There was a truth in there somewhere, and it wouldn't stop gnawing at her. She would have been lying if she said that a part of her didn't want to follow him out that door. What if he really could provide proof of his claims? Sure, the odds of that were small to the point of being imperceivable. But what if? She shook her head firmly. Thoughts like that would only play into whatever game Walter was playing. She needed to push them out, and she knew from experience that the best way to get rid of a thought was to drown it in alcohol. She looked down at her half-empty glass of whiskey. Picking it up, she held it up to her mouth, but didn't tilt it far enough for the brown liquid to flow into her throat. She kept it at her lips for a pair of heartbeats before setting it back down. She kept it at her lips for a pair of heartbeats before setting it back down. She had to know. Swearing under her breath, she shoved herself out of the booth and followed after Walter. As she did so, she heard more whispers coming from the group at the bar. She shot them a nasty look as she passed them. It was late, and there was no light coming from any of the other nearby businesses. It took a moment for Matilda's eyes to adjust to the dark. When they did, she saw Walter, not by the buildings, but instead standing in the middle of the street. He nodded at her. "You came just in time," he told her. "I was just about to head out." "You said that you have proof that what you said in there is true," she said by way of reply. "So what is it?" "It will be here in just a minute. You need to be standing where I'm standing if you want to see it." "What, right in the road? I really don't feel like getting hit by a bus." Walter snorted. "It's almost 2 in the morning. Does this little town of yours get a lot of buses filling the streets at 2 a.m.? Okay, fine." As Matilda stepped out into the street, there was a rumble of thunder overhead. The storm had been gathering since early in the afternoon, and it sounded like it was finally about to let loose. When she was almost to him, he took a long step back and motioned for her to stand where he had just been. "So what exactly are we waiting on?" she pressed. "Patience," Walter said. "It won't be long now. Do you remember when I told you that the rot corrupts a universe before devouring it? You are about to see indisputable evidence of that." She felt a drop of water touch her on the cheek. Pushing back her long brown hair, she turned her face up towards the sky. More of them struck her skin. She had always loved the rain, and the drops felt cool and refreshing. "Here we go," he said with approval in his voice. "What, the rain?" Matilda asked, turning her attention back to him. "Just give it a bit. Trust me." The drops quickly increased in frequency. Within moments, the rain started in earnest, soaking her hair and clothes. As much as she enjoyed this kind of weather, she didn't feel like standing in it with her clothes clinging tightly to her in front of a stranger. She turned to go back to the bar. Before she could take a step, a hand grabbed her by the upper arm and held her tightly in place. She tried to pull away, but Walter's grip was like iron. She looked back over her shoulder and saw him staring at her with an unreadable expression on his face. He didn't seem to be struggling at all to keep hold of her with just one hand. "Here's your proof," he told her, his voice barely audible above the storm. Something thick splattered against the top of her head. It didn't hurt, but there was definite weight behind whatever it was. With her free hand, she reached up and touched it with her finger. It had the consistency of oil, and when she looked at the finger, she found that it was covered in a black substance. More of it landed on her in the street around her. In her confusion, it took a few seconds to realize that it was falling from the sky with the rain. Without a word, Walter pulled down on her arm. His strength was incredible, and she was jerked out of a standing position to instead kneel on the wet concrete. She once again tried to struggle, this time opening her mouth to scream. With his free hand, he reached around and clamped it down over her mouth, stifling her screams, while also tilting her head up so that she was looking directly at the sky. More of the black fluid struck her face. She felt it slide across the curves. He released her arm and quickly used 2 fingers to pry her eyelids open. She started to panic as it made its way into her nostrils and eyes. Try as she might, though, Walter's grip kept her from moving and thrashing. As the seconds ticked by, her muscles began to loosen. She didn't know if it was because she had accepted that it wasn't doing any good, or if the black liquid was affecting her in some way. Surprisingly, it didn't really matter to her one way or another. In less than a minute, she was calm and no longer concerned with anything that was happening to her. "There we go," Walter said as he released his grip and took a step back. Matilda didn't move. She continued to feel the substance make its way into her body, both through her eyes and nostrils, as well as her now exposed mouth. It somehow managed to be both warm and cold at the same time. What you're experiencing is pure corruption, he explained. As the universe decays, that decay appears in many forms. Your body is absorbing it and is being changed by it. Mind, body, and soul, all of it warped and changed. He leaned in closer. You feel that, don't you? The corruption seeping into you and twisting everything that makes you, well, you. She didn't answer, but after a quick examination of her face, he nodded as his words were confirmed. I think that a part of us wants to be corrupted. It's like a tiny little piece knows the truth. The creator of all existence doesn't care about you. It abandoned you long before you or your parents or anyone's parents were born. If it doesn't give a shit, why should you? What's the point in tying yourself down with self-imposed moralities, right? Why limit your potential? Be free. Follow the example of the creator and just do whatever the fuck you want. Consequences be damned. The paralysis afflicting Matilda abruptly ended. She fell forward and her face nearly collided with the concrete, but she was able to get her hands under her just in time. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself up onto her feet before slowly exhaling. She felt more in control of herself than she ever had before. There you go, Walter said encouragingly. That's the feeling of being unshackled, the release of pointless inhibitions. When you strip those all away, it leaves you feeling human. Matilda turned her head towards him. Even though he had overpowered her just minutes earlier, she was not afraid of him. If anything, she was grateful to him. He'd opened her eyes and set her free. Would you be open to suggestion? He asked. Without a word, she nodded. I think you should celebrate your newfound freedom. Do something to mark the occasion, as it were. Have something in mind? She asked. Her voice was different. It was stronger and more confident than it had been in a long time. Maybe more so than it ever had. She liked the change. Well, maybe just the teeny tiniest inkling of an idea, yes, Walter admitted, pointing back towards the bar. Those assholes in there seem like they could use some education on the wonder that is the new you. She turned her head to look back at the bar. He was right, of course. The regulars had been tormenting her ever since her husband died. The only reason that she continued to frequent it was out of some petty desire to show them that they didn't bother her. They did, though. Every single night, their stares and snide comments and little jokes got under her skin a bit more. Now things were different, though. It was long past time for the harassment to stop. I've never done anything like this before, she said. I know, Walter replied with a sympathetic nod. Like I said back in the bar, you didn't have the look of a killer. It's okay, though. You're past all that now, and I have something that will help. He reached around his back and lifted his shirt. Taking something out of the waistband of his pants, he held it out to her and encouraged her to take it. She looked down at the object. It was a gun, its black body difficult to see in the darkness of the night. Without hesitation, she reached out and took it from him. She'd never held a gun before, and she was surprised by how heavy it was. She hefted it a few times to get the feeling of it. The safety is above the grip in the back, Walter informed her. You have to... Good, there you go. Just point and pull the trigger. It's that simple. It's going to kick when it fires, so be ready for that. There are 13 rounds in the magazine, and by my count, there were 4 people sitting at the bar. I don't know about you, but I like those odds. What do I do after I kill them? She asked. Whatever you want to, my dear. There's nothing holding you back now. I'm sure that you can come up with something. Maybe there are other people in your life that have done you wrong? There were. She was able to come up with a list of at least half a dozen people right on the spot. She nodded at him as a feeling of giddiness filled her. "Will you come watch me do it?" she asked. "I do like to watch," Walter said with a chuckle. "Unfortunately, I'm going to have to pass. I'm going to visit a few friends, and I want to be done before morning." Matilda frowned. "What happens when it's morning?" He put a hand on her shoulder. "I don't want to spoil the surprise for you. When you're done settling old debts, come find me. You can tell me all about what you've done, and after that, we can talk about a great opportunity for you. No spoilers. We'll get into it then. Just don't take long. Quick question for you. What's the name of this place, anyway?" "You mean the town?" "Craigsville." "Craigsville. I like it. Very simple. Enjoy yourself tonight, Matilda. Paint the town red." She grinned at him before turning on her heel and walking towards the bar. Walter watched as the rain fell around her, heavy drops splattering in the puddles. He remained silent as she opened the door and went inside. There was no hesitation in her movements. She had already made her decision, and she was simply following through with it. For a long moment there was only the sound of the rain. Walter waited patiently until the screams began. They were quickly followed by a loud crack of gunshots. He grinned, feeling the skin crack and pull away from around his mouth and eyes. Continuing down the road, he raised his face towards the sky again and enjoyed the sensation of it running down over his body. What a beautiful night it was. With a sigh, Stephen Tate half sat, half collapsed down onto the bench as he dropped his duffel bag on the floor next to him. It had been a long day, a long string of days really, and he was exhausted. The bus he was taking wouldn't arrive at the station until nearly midnight though, and that meant that he had a few hours to rest. He had been on the road for weeks, and everything was starting to blur together. It was so bad that he couldn't remember exactly how many days it had been since Peter Garrett, the sheriff of the cursed town of Broken Bend, Montana, had paid him a surprise visit at his apartment. Their encounter had ended in a flurry of blood and fire, and it had forced him to leave the little corner of the world he had carved out for himself. That hadn't been the only thing that had come out of that fight, of course. Stephen closed his eyes. It had also brought the wolf back out of wherever it had retreated to after it had been nearly obliterated in Broken Bend. At first it had been weak, so weak that he couldn't even sense its presence. It had grown stronger little by little after it had been reawakened, and while it still didn't communicate with him, he could definitely sense it inside of him. He didn't dare let it out, though. Whatever Broken Bend's resident otherworldly entity Malkaleth had done to it, the effects were lingering. Every time the wolf was released, their body would begin to burn with flames hotter than any natural fire. Too long in that form would lead to them being consumed. He had been trying to get in touch with Pembroke the entire time he had been on the road. Each attempt had been unsuccessful. That was extremely strange. Over the years, Pembroke had always either answered his calls or left messages for him at prearranged voicemail numbers. There had never been radio silence like this before. "Mind if I join you?" a woman's voice asked. Stephen opened his eyes and looked up at the speaker. She was wearing a knee-length black coat, and her blonde hair was tied back in a long ponytail. A pair of sunglasses adorned her face even though it was night. "I'm going to take your silence as you agreeing that I can sit down," she said as she flopped down on the bench next to him. "Thanks, I appreciate that. I'm tired as fuck. You look like you can relate." Stephen didn't respond. He had no idea what to say. He certainly didn't want company, but at the same time, she didn't seem to be giving him a lot of choice. Glancing around, he saw that there weren't any other benches on this side of the terminal. "So, where are you headed?" the woman asked. "Burbank," he answered, pulling a random city name out of thin air. He hoped that the shortness of the answer would be enough to convey his lack of interest in conversation. That hope was quickly dashed. "Burbank," she repeated. "Huh, that's interesting." "Why is that?" Stephen asked before he could stop himself. "A few reasons. First, you don't look like the kind of guy that would subject yourself to any of the Burbanks in the United States. Second, this bus route doesn't go to any of those Burbanks. Third and finally, your ticket is sticking out of your coat pocket, and it clearly says Dallas." He snapped his head towards her. "Don't worry about it," she said with a small smile. "You're bound to get sloppy when you've been traveling without sleep for as long as you have been, Mr. Tate. Or do you prefer Stephen?" Even though his body was exhausted, he was moving before he even realized he was doing so. He was almost instantly on his feet, and he leaned over the woman threateningly as he felt the wolf stir. Her eyes went wide as she put up her hands. "Holy shit, that was fast," she said, more with surprise than fear. "And this is with the issues that you're having right now? No wonder Pembroke thought so highly of you." "Pembroke?" Stephen asked, his eyes narrowing. "You know Pembroke?" "Well, yeah, I knew him really well." She tilted her head slightly. "Oh, damn, you've been out of touch for a while, haven't you? You haven't heard. Pembroke is dead." He hesitated. "He's dead?" "Yeah, he is. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news." "You're lying." "No." She looked him in the eye. "I'm not." Stephen stared at her for a long moment before sitting back down on the bench. Neither he nor the wolf was sensing any danger coming from her, and there didn't seem to be any deceit coming from her either. He ran a hand over his face and looked up at the ceiling. "How?" he asked. "He was murdered," she answered, her voice quiet. "Killed by an old rival in his quarters on the Atlantean Tribute." "You're going to have to be more specific. I got the feeling that Pembroke had a lot of enemies." She smiled slightly. "Very true. This one is the oldest of them all, and a lot more personal of one than the others. A really fucked up bastard named Gangley." Stephen's jaw tightened. "I've heard of him." "I'm not surprised. Pembroke kind of went out of his way to make sure that everyone he trusted was warned about him. Not that you asked, but my name is Charlotte. Charlotte Lewis." "Stephen Tate." She snorted. "Yeah, I already know that, remember?" "Oh, yeah, right." Charlotte reached into her coat and produced an envelope. She looked at it for a moment before handing it to him. He took it from her and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of parchment paper. He unfolded it and found that it was a letter, one that was written in Pembroke's unmistakable handwriting. There was a picture of Stephen paperclipped to it. "Find Stephen Tate," the letter read. "Tell him the full truth about himself." "The full truth?" he asked in confusion. "What does that mean?" "What it means is you're a much more complicated person than you realize," Charlotte told him, folding her hands in her lap. "I don't think that a bus station is the right place to have this conversation, though. My car's parked around the corner. Can I buy you a late dinner?" Stephen nodded and picked up his bag. He followed her as she led him away from the station and down the street. He wasn't sure what to make of this woman. She carried herself with a confidence and ease that made it clear that she was used to being in charge of a situation. At the same time, she wasn't forceful about it. People filled with confidence often tried to swing that confidence around like a stick and batter others with it. Not this woman, though. It was more subtle than that. He wondered how much she knew about him. Clearly, Pembroke had filled her in on at least some of the details of both who and what he was, but that didn't mean he had told her everything. As they arrived at an old beat-to-hell Dodge Charger, he found himself conflicted about whether he should go with her or not. With a grunt, Stephen forced his doubts down. He didn't like having to put his trust in others. That was something he had never been comfortable with. In this case, though, there wasn't much of a choice. His entire plan had been to keep on the move until he could get in touch with Pembroke to work out what to do about his condition. Now that wasn't possible. If this woman had some insight that could help him, he needed to go along with her until she revealed it to him. He had barely gotten his seatbelt on when she pulled the car out into the street and headed north. Glancing over at the speedometer, he saw that she was going much faster than the speed limit, and the car wasn't struggling at all. Apparently, the Charger wasn't in as rough shape as it appeared. "So here's how this is going to work," Charlotte told him. "I'm going to tell you what that note means, and after I do, you're going to have a choice to make. Nothing happens here without your say-so. That sound okay to you?" "Fair enough," Stephen said through gritted teeth as she took a turn so fast that he was surprised the car's tires stayed on the ground. "Good. All right, so you've lived most of your life with a second voice in your head, right? The voice of the wolf, as Pembroke described it to me. This has led you to believe that you're a werewolf." "I don't believe that," he corrected her. "I am that." "Well, no, actually you're not. Let me finish before we get to that, though. That way I don't forget anything. You've had this, wolf inside of you most of your life, and you've grown to both understand it and to coexist with it. From what I was told, the two of you are, for all intents and purposes, fully symbiotic at this point. Is that a fair description?" He hesitated. "I've never really thought of it like that before, but I guess that's accurate." "How long have the two of you been like this?" "I'm not really sure. The wolf's always been with me for as long as I can remember, but we didn't figure out how to maintain some sort of balance until I was a teenager." "That long, huh?" Charlotte frowned. "That's going to make this a lot harder." Stephen stared at her for a few seconds. "Make what harder?" She didn't immediately answer. Instead, she remained silent as she seemed to mentally work her way through something. When she did speak, there was no uncertainty in her voice. "You aren't a werewolf, Stephen," Charlotte informed him. "You're actually something much more rare, maybe even completely unique. You are a chimera." Stephen opened his mouth to respond, but she continued on before he could get a word out. "I completely get why you thought that you're a werewolf. Pembroke did too, at least until recently. It wasn't until your body absorbed Malcoleth's flame in Broken Bend that he realized what you really are." "I don't understand," Stephen interjected, trying to wrap his head around what she was saying. "I turn into a werewolf, but you're saying that I'm not one. And what the hell is a chimera?" The second question is the one to start with. In Greek mythology, a chimera is a creature that is basically a patchwork quilt of other animals. Body of a lion, a snake for a tail, a goat head growing out of its back, that sort of thing. In reality, a chimera is a person that is able to take in and control multiple types of paranormal energy. Your lycanthropy is just the tip of the iceberg of what your body is capable of. I don't... You do, actually. Pembroke sent you to Broken Bend a while back. While you were there, you got into a fight with an infernal named Malcoleth. That was pretty stupid, by the way. You're not nearly strong enough to take on an infernal. Stephen looked away. Yeah, well, I didn't exactly have much of a choice at the time. Fair enough. She glanced over at him. Here's the thing. You shouldn't have survived. a direct assault from Malkaleth's heat is enough to vaporize a person. I'm not talking about killing that person. I mean reducing them to less than ash. You took multiple blasts and lived. He clenched his hands into fists as he whispered, "Barely." The reason that you survived is because your body absorbed and processed a lot of that heat. In essence, you were unconsciously assimilating it and adding it to your own biology. Under normal circumstances, you would have been able to do just that. The problem is that we're talking about an infernal. Its power overwhelmed your body. It still is. That's why you're having trouble coexisting with the fire, and it's why it burns away at you when you try to. Stephen tried to process what Charlotte was telling him. How do I get rid of it then? She shook her head. You can't. That's not how this works. If you can learn to control it, though, it should fully integrate into your body and no longer burn you. Instead, you'll be able to harness it, weaponize it, become something more than you already are, and maybe help save all of us along the way. So here's that choice I mentioned earlier, Stephen. Do you want to go get that late dinner? Or do you want to go try to save the world? Off in the distance, a siren began to wail. It was barely audible over the heavy wind blasting through the trees, and for a few moments, Michael Dyer wasn't sure he was actually hearing it. When it called out a second time, however, he was able to not only confirm that it was real, but also recognize it as the town's emergency alert. He knew that it would continue on for 2 to 3 minutes before an announcement would be made over the speaker system as to what was happening and how the Lamplight Woods citizen should proceed. He didn't bother to listen, however. There are more important things to attend to, and besides, it wasn't like it would be about anything else than the heavy storms currently going through the area. Those storms were the reason that he was out in the woods in the middle of the night. There was a burst of static from the radio clipped to his belt. That static was followed by a woman's voice. He couldn't make out the exact words over the howling wind, but he was pretty sure he heard his name. Unclipping the radio, he held it up to his mouth and pressed the button on the side. "What was that, Maggie?" he asked in a voice barely below a shout. "I couldn't hear you." "I asked if you found anything yet," Sheriff Maggie Grant repeated. "No. Negative. Whatever the hell you're supposed to say on these things." "Nothing here either. Are you sure this thing's out here?" "I'm sure. Keep an eye out and let me know if you find anything." "Same to you." Michael put the radio back on his belt and started forward once again. He didn't dare give away his position by using a flashlight, so instead, he moved carefully and took advantage of the lightning flashing in the sky to help him through the darker sections. He had only gone a few yards when a sharp pain went through his leg. Swearing, he leaned up against a nearby tree to rest for a moment. It was less than a month after he was told that he no longer needed to use a brace or crutches, and in theory, he should still be taking it easy for a while. He didn't have time to just sit around doing nothing, though. All he could do was hope that it would hold up, and that he didn't cause any further damage to it. After a moment, the pain subsided, and he was able to continue on. The prior week, he had gotten a second opinion on the limb, and that doctor had confirmed what his first had told him. The leg was never going to fully regain the strength it once had. The damage had been too severe. The doctor hadn't been able to give him a concrete answer as to how much strength he would be able to recover, but she had guessed that it would be around 75%, at most. Michael pushed those thoughts out of his mind. He had to keep himself focused on the task at hand. He pushed himself through a group of scraggly bushes and found himself in a small clearing with a rundown old house in the center. Gathering his bearings, he realized that he had arrived at the Fordham cabin. It had been built by one of the town's founding fathers back in the early years of Lamplight Woods, and it was now a historical landmark. He hadn't been there since he was a teenager. The wind stopped. It didn't slowly die down. In the middle of a strong gust, it just stopped. Michael froze in place and listened intently. He turned his head to the left as he heard a crackle of electricity in that direction. As he watched, a small point of white light appeared in the darkness. It was followed by a second, and then a third. Soon there were hundreds of the tiny orbs floating a few feet off the ground, less than a dozen yards away from him. He didn't move a muscle as he tried to remain calm and keep himself focused. The creatures were called storm smiths, and they were sentient beings whose bodies were made of electricity. Individually, they weren't very dangerous. They could only generate a few volts of electricity at most. The danger came in the fact that they always traveled in swarms, and by sending current through one another, they could create surges strong enough to burn a person to cinders within seconds. To make matters worse, a large enough swarm could even manipulate the electromagnetic field across a large area. This particular swarm was to blame for the heavy storms battering Lamplight Woods. If they were left to their own devices, the storms would continue to escalate. The clouds overhead were already beginning to swirl. It wouldn't be long before tornadoes began to form, and once that happened, the town would be in extreme danger. Luckily for the world, storm smiths were extremely rare. The flip side was that it meant that there was very little information about them. Michael had to admit that he probably wouldn't have been able to create a good game plan for them if it hadn't been for his father. The man had managed to contain them for years in an underground bunker. He may have been a shit parent, but he hadn't been as incompetent as he had seemed. Knowing that it wouldn't be long before the Stormsmiths became an issue after they had been set free, Michael had dismantled the chamber they had been contained in for any insight as to how his father had kept creatures of pure electricity locked up. The answer had been simple, so simple that he felt a bit embarrassed he hadn't thought of it. Beneath the paneling covering the walls, floor, and ceiling were cables carrying a strong current. They had been tuned to carry a charge that was the same polarity as the creatures themselves. Like two magnets with the same polarity, they pushed against one another and made it impossible for the Stormsmiths to leave. That wasn't something that Michael could replicate in the wild. Instead, he had to get more creative. He had no intention of capturing them once again. That would only make it possible for them to escape and cause trouble again somewhere down the line. He had a more permanent solution in mind. He slowly retrieved his radio and pressed the talk button. "Maggie," he said quietly, "I found them. They're at Fordham cabin. Don't answer back. I don't want to agitate. Don't answer back. I don't want to agitate them." He lowered the radio, hoping that she received the transmission. The devices have been working properly so far, but broadcasts could get a bit iffy during storms. Clipping it on his belt, he took a deep breath. "It's showtime, Mira," he muttered. There was another crackle of electricity, but this time the tone was different. The smell of ozone filled his nostrils as Mira appeared on the ground in front of him. The blue rabbit-like creature glanced over its shoulder at him, the small horn on its forehead looking very bright in the darkness. He nodded once. Because of its animal-like appearance, it was easy to forget that Mira was an extremely intelligent creature. The Al-Mirage were spirits that lived extremely long lives. During that lifetime, they grew and evolved mentally to the point that they were smart as any human, maybe even smarter. As far as he could tell, Mira was at the point of its lifespan where it had roughly the intelligence of a teenager. Mira knew the plan, and Michael in turn knew that he didn't have to go over that plan again. Taking a long step back, he allowed the creature to get to it. Sparks began to fly off of Mira as arcs of electricity ran up and down its body. The strength of the current raised and lowered as it made small adjustments in the flow. Michael glanced up at the stormsmiths. They had moved a bit closer and were slowly moving back and forth. For the moment, they were still keeping their distance. He licked his lips. The plan was dangerous, and there was no guarantee it was going to work. At its core, it was fairly simple. Have Mira use its ability to manipulate electricity to change the polarity of the stormsmiths so that they repelled each other. That would theoretically make it impossible for them to swarm, rendering them harmless. Two issues with the plan. The first was that it depended on Mira being able to find the right charge to reverse the polarity. The second was that for a swarm this large, it was going to take a lot of power, more than it was able to generate on its own. The first problem was up to Mira to solve, and he was sure that it was up to the task. The second one was why Maggie was lugging around a portable generator, and assuming that she got his message, she was headed that way now. There were still a lot of things that had to go right, though. He shook his head in an unsuccessful attempt to clear the doubts from his mind. It didn't really matter. They were committed to the plan now. They couldn't back out even if they wanted to. He was starting to wish that wasn't the case. One by one, the stormsmiths were changing from white to red. Their movements were becoming more hurried, and they began to approach. "We definitely have their attention," he said to Mira, taking another step back. Mira didn't answer. Instead, he remained focused on the stormsmiths, its teeth bared and its eyes squinted. All of its focus was on finding the correct charge. As he watched, one of the stormsmiths changed its color from red to blue. It was almost impossible to see the single pinprick in the swarm, but it was unmistakably the same color as Mira. It was working. Mira was actually changing the polarity of the small creatures. A few more of the stormsmiths turned azure. As they did so, they were pushed a short distance away from each other. The other stormsmiths reacted to the sudden change by moving faster. Visible electrical charges flowed between them. Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. There was no way that Mira was going to be able to get all of them changed, not before they were both killed. There was a crashing noise in the bushes to his left. He didn't dare look away from the swarm, but out of the corner of his eye he saw Maggie emerge from the foliage. She hurried over to his side and set the small but heavy portable generator on the ground. She knelt down and grabbed the cord. She pulled it hard, and the generator sputtered to life. The light coming from Mira immediately intensified. It stood up straighter and growled loudly as more stormsmiths turned blue at a much faster rate. The ones that became blue were immediately thrown away from the swarm. "Looks like I got here just in time," Maggie observed as she stood back up. "It seems to be working. It looks like Mira's drawing power from the generator." Michael didn't answer for a moment. He was concentrating on the remaining red stormsmiths. The intensity of their light was growing, but their movements had stopped, and they were simply hovering in the air. Something was happening, but he couldn't figure out what. Thunder rumbled again, this time much closer than before. Cautiously, he tore his eyes away from the swarm and looked up. The clouds overhead were spinning and churning. He felt a cold chill run down his spine as he suddenly understood. "Get back!" he yelled over the noise. Grabbing Maggie's arm, he half pulled, half dragged her towards the tree line. As he did so, the first of the bolts of lightning struck the ground less than a dozen feet away, blasting dirt and debris into the air. The stormsmiths understood the danger they were in, and they were retaliating. More lightning raked the immediate area. They made it under the trees and quickly got down as low to the forest floor as they could. As Michael watched, a series of bolts slammed into Fordham cabin. The building was already unstable at best, and the force of the lightning tore it apart. The wood burst into flames as it was thrown in every direction. Mira remained in the clearing, continuing to affect the swarm with its own electricity. The lightning seemed to be having the unintended effect of giving the creature even more power to work with. Within less than a minute, the last of the Stormsmiths at the very center of the group turned blue. The swarm suddenly burst apart. It happened with such force that Michael felt like he had been slapped in the face. The Stormsmiths were flung in opposite directions. The lightning immediately stopped. Within moments they returned to the clearing, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get close to one another. Eventually they all departed, and everything was quiet. "Is it over?" Maggie asked, her voice steady but tense. "It looks like it," Michael replied as he slowly got to his feet. They went back out into the clearing. Mira was laying down, its glow having returned to normal, and its back rising and falling as it breathed heavily. Michael smiled as he picked it up and held it close to his chest. "You did great," he told it. "Absolutely incredible. Why don't you go back to Forgotten Tales and get some rest?" Mira nuzzled his shoulder for a moment before disappearing. He closed his eyes and sighed as he rubbed the back of his neck. It had been a long night, and he was looking forward to going to sleep himself. "I'm not looking forward to explain to the mayor why a historical landmark got blown up," Maggie commented dryly. "Next time we'll try to blow up something newer," he answered, opening his eyes again and looking at the remains of the cabin. "Damn, the Stormsmiths really did a number on it." They walked over to the ruined cabin. A few of the fires were still burning. Luckily the flames were small, and they were able to stamp them out easily. Something caught Michael's eye. On the ground in the spot where the chimney had once stood, the dim light was reflecting off of something metallic. Curious, he went over to it to take a closer look. He prodded it with his finger before using his hand to clear the dirt and debris off of it. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "I'm not sure," he replied slowly. "Hold on." There was a small indentation on the side of the panel. Hesitating for just a moment, he pressed his finger into it. There was a hiss of escaping air as the panel raised slightly. He lifted it up and swung it off to the side on hidden hinges. "There's a ladder," he said as he carefully looked through the opening. "I can't tell how far it goes down." "What the hell?" Maggie asked as she knelt down next to him. "This looks new. Way newer than the pioneer days, anyway." "There's only one way to know where this goes." "Yeah," she sighed. "Flip a coin to see who goes first?" When I was 2 years old, I witnessed my first murder. Both my parents worked long hours. Times were tough, and it was necessary to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. I know that neither of them enjoyed spending long periods of time away from home. It may surprise you to know that my mother and father were incredibly fond of me, loved me, even. Looking back, it was that love that likely drove them to work themselves half to death to provide. They were good parents, good people. Because of their work, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. She was an interesting woman, very opinionated, and not afraid to share those opinions with anyone possessing working ears. That mouth of hers got her in trouble from time to time, but she didn't care. No one was going to tell her what she could and couldn't say. I only remember her vaguely. I know that she loved me, though, and I loved her. I remember the night in question vividly. That's kind of surprising, isn't it? I mean, I was only 2. Most people don't have memories from that age, and the ones that do tend to have that recollection only have fuzzy facsimiles of true memories. That's how most of mine are, but this one particular one, It's crystal clear. I was sitting on the floor in the living room of my house, playing with a set of blocks that I had gotten as a gift the previous Christmas. My grandmother was in her usual spot, a rather hideous pink stuffed chair that she had purchased at a thrift shop. She was knitting. The tap, tap, tapping of the needles as she worked was rhythmic and soothing, and as was so often the case, the sound had begun to lull me towards sleep. There was a knock on the door. My grandmother stopped her knitting and set her tools down on the chair's armrest before standing up with a grunt. She was getting up there in years, and it took a few steps for her to straighten out her back. Crossing over to the front door, she opened it. I'm not sure what she was expecting. A delivery man, perhaps? Or maybe a salesman. This was back in the days of door-to-door vacuum cleaner sales, after all. If you wanted to hawk your wares, you needed to pound the pavement looking for customers. I'm quite sure that she wasn't expecting to come face to face with a man holding a knife. She tried to scream, but he pushed one black-gloved hand against her mouth to smother her cries. The first stab made her bend over and clutch her stomach. The second brought her to her knees. The third and fourth caused her to fall to the floor. The fifth made her lie still. Even after my grandmother was dead, the man continued to slice into her with the knife. At the age I was, you don't really understand the concept of death. You certainly don't have the mental capability to understand murder. My eyes weren't seeing the ending of a life. What I was seeing was splashes of the color red arcing through the air, the sparkle of light reflecting off of metal, and a man that I didn't know to fear leaning over my grandmother. I'm not sure how long he kept sliding the knife in and out of my grandmother. I do know that it was quite a while. When he was finished, he turned his attention to me. He gazed at me for a long time, most of his face hidden in the shadows that were cast from his hat. After a while, a smile formed at one corner of his mouth. With a wink towards me, he stood up, wiped the knife off on the back of the pink chair, and went back out into the warm afternoon. That was my first experience with what many call evil. I've thought back on it countless times throughout the years, but it's only been recently that I've come to understand how much it shaped me. It brought something out in me that, although it was with me from birth, I didn't understand or know how to process. My grandmother's murder didn't create anything. It just gave me access to the darkness sooner. When my mother came home from work that evening, she found me still in the living room. I was sitting in the middle of the blood that had flowed out of my grandmother. After she called the police, my mother took me to the kitchen sink and washed the gore off of me. I remember staring at the blood as it circled the drain. It made me think of the watercolors that my mother painted with outside on long, lazy weekends. Thanks to the man with the knife, I understood something at an early age that most people don't figure out during the course of their entire lives. Killing isn't simply the ending of a life. It's an act of creation. The blood must flow to provide the material for something new. This realization made me an outsider. As I grew up, I was surrounded by other children that either couldn't or wouldn't see what I saw. It was frustrating at the time, but as I got older, I came to understand that they couldn't help but be blinded to it. They hadn't had the same experience that I had. No one had been there for them to open their eyes. I tried to be the one to do that for them. I went over it over and over again until I was blue in the face and completely out of breath. It was all for nothing. Without experiencing a life-changing event themselves, they simply couldn't relate. There was only one thing to do, of course. If I couldn't tell them, I had to show them. I kept that knowledge in the back of my head for years. It wasn't until I was 16 that I felt that I was ready physically to do what needed to be done. When I learned that a girl named Blair Peterson was throwing a party while her parents were out of town, I knew that I had my time and place. Like many of you, I was bullied growing up. My personal tormentor was a boy named Larry Duncan, a simple name for a rather simple person. He was nearly twice my size, and he preferred to take out his inexplicable dislike of me with his fists rather than his words. I wasn't the only kid that he bullied, and I knew that I'd be doing not one, but 2 services to the world at large with my demonstration. Right as the party was reaching its peak, I presented my work to my fellow classmates. There was Larry Duncan on Blair Peterson's lawn, his skin peeled off and his limbs detached. In my naivety, I thought that the people present would experience their own revelations just the way that I had. I was such an innocent then, completely unaware of how the world worked. Instead of understanding and gratefulness, I was confronted with fear and anger and disgust. While I was naive, I was still smart enough to know what those looks on my peers' faces meant. That night that I took my first life was also the same night that I abandoned my own life. I ran from that little town and never looked back, knowing that my name would be on the lips of all the children that saw me as nothing more than a common murderer. I took a new name, Walter Douglas. I lived on the streets for years. As I said, though, I was an intelligent child, and through means deemed legal and illegal by the systems in place, I managed to pull myself up and make a new life for myself. The entire time I did so, I ran through what had happened over and over again. I couldn't figure out what had gone so wrong. Then, one day as I was sitting on a bench in a park, I caught sight of a mother pushing her young child on a swing. That's when it suddenly clicked. The problem had been that my classmates were too old. Their parents had already made sure to fill their heads with the untruths that ignorant minds believed. I needed to deliver my message to those who were still young enough to be untainted by those untruths. I also needed a vessel to deliver that message that the parents wouldn't suspect was undoing their unknowingly harmful passed-on beliefs. On that warm June afternoon, Bingo's Circus Extravaganza was born. I couldn't do it on my own, though. As time went on, I surrounded myself with like-minded people that not only shared my vision, but had visions of their own as well. The first was Tucker, or traumatized Tucker. He was a soldier who felt abandoned by his country, and when he returned from an unpopular war, he was simply discarded. I saw his worth, though. He became my first real friend and confidant. He painted on his true face and became Bango the Clown in my circus. Tucker showed me that there wasn't just one way to bring the light of death to the world. He not only showed it through killing, but he even consumed those he brought to an end. A very practical and frugal way of handling things. Next came my lovely Poe, the most beautiful and talented woman that I have ever known. She had a very special gift, a gift that allowed her to see and reach into other worlds. It was a gift that should have been marveled at and celebrated by everyone, and yet all that it got her in life was being shunned and ridiculed. Tucker and I took her in and showed her how special she was to us. Others came later, people that shared our goals and philosophies. Tucker, Poe, and I welcomed each of them with open arms. Together, we became a family as we brought the truths that are found through experiencing death and horror to the next generation. We were happy. Here's a lesson I've learned the hard way. Life doesn't want you to be happy. Life itself is as much of an oppressor as we humans are. Just when everything that I had ever wanted was in my hands, I was diagnosed with cancer. My own body was betraying me. The cells that made up my form were turning against their own functions, rewriting themselves in an effort to strangle the life from me from the inside. Is there a better example of this world's twisted sense of morality than that? I would have died if not for my wonderful Poe. She used her limitless gifts to perform a miracle. She snatched me back from the brink and pulled me from my treacherous body. The world had tried to snuff my flame, but she lit it anew. Triumph created from tragedy. It was poetic. For a while, it seemed as if I had bested the world when no one else ever had. But that's not how it really works. The world doesn't allow itself to be bested. It always has to have its own way. My life was saved, but in return, it sent others to take the lives of my family. When that happened, I knew an even greater truth about this world than I had learned while innocently sitting in that pool of blood. No, not a singular truth. A series of truths. Today, I'm going to share these revelations with you. We all want to be the one the world takes notice of and grants its blessings to. We want the power to change the world in the same way that Chaucer did with a quill and Monet did with a brush. We want to be struck with the bolt of fate and purpose as the heavens open and a loud booming voice declares that yes, we are here for a reason, and that reason reaches far beyond living a simple, mundane existence. We want the power to break free of the shackles of mediocrity so that we can launch ourselves away from the ground and soar. But we can't. Every moment of every day brings us closer to our personal realization that life isn't just unfair. Life is a system rigged against us. A fair system would see us all starting at the same point, and through our own skills and willpower, rise through that system. Darwin called it survival of the fittest. I call it fair. That is not the life that we live in. We've all experienced the true nature of existence. People of lower intelligence or a lack of work ethic, or a combination of the two, begin with an insurmountable head start because their parents have a larger number on a bank's ledger. Pathetic bottom feeders find themselves at the top of the food chain due to there being so many other bottom feeders that can relate to them. This is a world ruled by bullies and thugs, cretins that can barely pronounce the word quality, let alone live up to it. Not just our world either. I have seen the other side of the curtain, gone through and beyond the veil that separates our reality from all others. I have walked the hallways of the Great Lodge and peered through its windows into the afterlife. There was no paradise, no garden, no friends and family to greet us as we cross into a gentle light. What waits for us is a cold, bleak darkness that cares so little for us that it can't be bothered to be heaven or hell. What I have seen in the lodge is proof of what I've known since I was that small boy in that blood-stained living room. Nothing matters. Not a single thing matters in a way that is lasting. We're all just insignificant specks of dust huddled together on a slightly larger speck of dust that we call our world. Despite us craving significance, despite our cries and prayers begging the unanswering universe for nothing more than to simply matter, the full sum of us is less than zero. Do not mistake the tone of my voice for nihilism. No, that quavering that you're detecting isn't the acceptance of an empty existence. It's excitement. When I'm told that nothing matters, what I hear is that I'm being presented with the ultimate freedom. A world where nothing matters is a world without consequences. It's a world where you are free to satisfy your wants and needs instead of being trapped in that damn system that feeds off your blood, sweat, and tears to only satisfy the so-called elite. What we have, for for the first time since our ancestors crawled out of their caves, is a blank canvas. Like Chaucer, we will write the stories of our generation with our quills, but our ink will be the blood of those that have sought to define us. We will create beauty and joy the way that Monet did, but our paint will be the black corruption of our rotting world repurposed. We are the architects of our lives now. Others will never be able to gleefully push us back down with the heel of the boot again. The rot isn't the downfall of our world. The rot is our liberator. You all feel this. The black corruption that has seeped in shows you the truth if you're willing to accept that truth. The time of glorious change is upon us. If you ever feel nervousness or doubt begin to creep in, simply look to those around you. You are not alone. There are thousands of others ready to face this brave new world with you, and that's just in our gathering today. As the corruption spreads, there will be more, millions more, billions. What we create together will be glorious and everlasting, and it all starts here today. My name is Walter Douglas, and as the world crumbles, I will rebuild it in my own image. Will you help me build? Come, friends. Come take a walk with me. The rain continued to fall outside. Sarah Dyer couldn't hear the noise when the music was blaring, but during the moments between songs, she could hear it striking the metal roof of the gymnasium. It wasn't something that she was actively trying to hear. It just really stood out in the brief silence. For what had to be the 1,000th time, she ran her hands along the sides of her dress. She was extremely uncomfortable being in anything but jeans and a t-shirt, especially in front of people her own age. She didn't have much of a choice in this particular instance, however. Prom called for something a bit more fancy and a bit less, well, not. She watched the various couples twirling around in the middle of the gym. They were dancing only in the loosest sense of the word. It was more like slowly rotating while bobbing to the left and right. Still, they seemed to be having a good time, though apparently their complete lack of rhythm wasn't an issue for them. Carefully maneuvering himself between the turning bodies, Josh Taylor made his way through the crowd and over to her. He smiled as he approached. She felt a momentary stab of annoyance. He seemed much more comfortable in the suit that he was wearing than she was in her dress. That annoyance quickly turned into amusement as she remembered the expression on his face when he had picked her up at her house. That look of stunned shock had been completely worth the effort of dressing up. "Sorry that took so long," he apologized. "I ended up having to go over to the bathroom on the far side of the building. Some people were, let's say, enjoying each other in the closer one." "Aw, that's both adorable and disgusting," Sarah replied with a smile. "At least they're having fun." From some of the sounds coming out of those stalls, I'm not sure that's actually the case. "Are you telling me that two inexperienced teenagers groping at each other doesn't lead to pure bliss like in the movies? I'm shocked, young Joshua, simply shocked." He grinned. "Oh, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that we both enjoy our groping." She playfully punched him in the arm. "Stop that. You're saying that you don't enjoy it?" Despite her best efforts, Sarah felt herself blush. "Ah, there it is," Josh said, smiling. "I hate when you do that." "Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. It's hard to resist sometimes. I talked with the DJ and put in a request, so we have decent music to look forward to in just a bit. She sighed. Thank God. There's only so much of this auto-tuned pop crap that I can take. What did you pick? Just a little Michael Sembello. She raised an eyebrow. I am assuming we're talking Maniac from Flashdance? Of course. I'm a man of exquisite taste. There was a sound from the far side of the gymnasium. It was difficult to make out over the music and talking, but it sounded like yelling. It seemed to be coming from out in the hallway beyond the double doors. Josh must have heard it too, as he tilted his head slightly. Sounds like Principal Brandt found the happy bathroom couples, he commented. Seeing that man's ancient face is bound to kill the mood, she observed. The song that was currently playing came to an end, and the couples on the dance floor stopped rotating and clapped. Even with the high school-aged teens from Lamplight Woods mixed in, Craigsville High School was a small school. There were only 40 or so students at prom, which accounted for most of the junior and senior classes. Before another song could begin, there was another yell from outside the gym. Sarah's head snapped towards it. This wasn't the sound of a few horny teenagers getting in trouble. It was terrified screaming. Everyone in the gym fell silent and looked around with concerned looks on their faces. The screaming came to an abrupt end. There was a long moment of silence. Sarah slipped her hand into Josh's. Something was very wrong. The hallway door slowly opened. A woman stepped into the gym. She was wearing a jacket and jeans, and she was covered in some kind of black liquid. Her eyes were wide as she surveyed the gathered teenagers and school staff members. "Hello, little pigs," she said, reaching into her coat pocket with one hand. "Won't you let us in?" More people, all of them soaked in the same dark fluid and brandishing a wide variety of tools and weapons, filed into the gym behind the woman. She grinned broadly and produced a long knife from inside her jacket. "If you don't," she continued slowly, "we'll huff, and we'll puff, and we'll bash your fucking skulls in." The stained people swarmed towards the gathered students and teachers. Sarah watched in horror as they proceeded to tear apart everyone from the school that came within arm's reach. The Spanish teacher, Mr. Cardington, was pinned to the ground and had his head repeatedly stepped on until he stopped moving in a pool of his own blood. A blonde girl, a senior that she recognized but didn't know the name of, screamed at the top of her lungs as she was stabbed over and over again. Countless other acts of violence and depravity were taking place in front of her, and all that she could do was watch, her mind blank and her stomach churning. It took her a few moments to realize that Josh had wrapped his arms around her and was dragging her to the opposite side of the gym. She blinked, then shook her head firmly to clear it. The students and faculty were headed in their direction. She nodded once at Josh to let him know that she was okay before they ran for the unblocked doors at the end of the basketball court. Josh reached it first. Instead of slowing down, he lowered his shoulder and slammed into it at full speed. It went flying open a few feet before striking someone on the other side. Josh kept moving, and after less than a second of resistance, the door opened all the way. He turned to reach for her hand. Together, they jumped over the prone body of the black, liquid-covered man that had been blocking the door only seconds before and hurried down the hallway. They had almost reached the end when another group of the crazed people came around the corner in front of them. Thinking fast, Sarah turned sharply and pulled Josh into the closest classroom. She shut the door behind them. There was no lock. Of course there wasn't. This was a public school. Classrooms didn't have locks because there weren't supposed to be anything going on in them that would require one. She watched Josh hurry over to the windows before quickly following. The school was only a single story. If they could break out one of the windows, they'd be able to escape. Her hand was reaching for the latch when his hand snatched her wrist and pulled her hand back. "Look at the glass," he hissed, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. She immediately saw what had caught his attention. The large pane of glass was smeared with the same black substance that was covering the people attacking the school. It was only on the outside, and it seemed to be falling with the rain. That, whatever it is, has to be a part of what's going on, he said. If we touch it, it might do the same thing to us that it's done to them. We can't just stay here, she pointed out. Do you think they saw us come in? I don't know. I don't think so. She looked around the room for another way out. They had ended up in the chemistry classroom. Glassware and equipment were neatly tucked away in cabinets. The teacher's desk was on one side of the room, and the long wooden tables used by students for experiments were on the other. The only door leading out of the room was the one they had entered through. The voices from out in the hallway were growing closer. We're going to have to risk the rain, Josh said, his expression unhappy. Damn it. He hurried over to one of the storage cabinets and pulled it open. Searching through it for a moment, he pulled out 2 large objects and tucked them under his arm. Coming back over to her, he handed her one of the objects. Fire blankets, he explained, unfolding the one he was still holding. Wrap yourself up in it as best you can. Make sure you cover your head and keep it low enough to make sure that, whatever it is, doesn't get into your face. They wrapped the blankets around them and pulled up a section to act as a makeshift hood. Sarah was surprised at how heavy they were. The material was thick, and she instantly began to sweat. When they had finished, they looked each other over to make sure they were covered as much as possible. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. With a wordless nod, Josh picked up a stool, took a deep breath, and smashed it into one of the windows. The glass shattered, the noise echoing throughout the room. Working quickly, they used their blankets to clear the shards from the frame. They finished in just a few moments, and Josh motioned for Sarah to go first. She hopped up onto the short ledge and slid through the opening. She winced as a tiny missed piece of glass scraped against her cheek and drew blood. Josh had a harder time making it out because of his larger frame, but he managed to wiggle through and join her in the small courtyard. She could hear the lunatics yelling from the room they had just left as they hurried around the building towards the parking lot. The black ichor-filled rain pelted hard against the fire blanket, striking it so hard that she felt each drop hammer into the cloth. The substance that had already fallen to the ground was viscous and difficult to walk through. She gritted her teeth and continued on. She was concentrating so hard on her movements that she almost ran into Josh when he came to a sudden stop. His body was blocking her view of what was in front of them. She moved slightly to the side to see what was going on. A single person was standing in their path. She could tell by the body shape that it was a woman, but she couldn't make out any features in the darkness. The figure took a single step forward and tilted her head slightly. So, tell me, young man, the woman said to Josh, just what intentions do you have for my daughter? Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the woman's face for the briefest of moments. Sarah sucked in a breath in shock. She knew this woman. She had never met her, but she had seen her face in countless pictures since she was little. They shared the same long red hair. The woman standing in their way was Sarah's mother, Evelyn Stone. She had been dead for nearly 17 years. It's a trick, Josh told her. It has to be. Your dad said Poe tried this back at the carnival, remember? No trick, the woman said, holding her arms out. I'm the real deal. I think Sarah already knows that, though. He took her body, Sarah choked out. A few months earlier, the creature known as Bingo had desecrated her mother's grave, stealing her body and leaving the empty casket in the backyard of Sarah's house as a message to her father. Sarah had assumed that he had done that simply to screw with them. Apparently he had been planning something much more elaborate. If you'll excuse us, Evelyn was saying to Josh, I'd like some time alone with my daughter. We have a lot of catching up to do. Yeah, that's not going to happen, Josh growled. Oh, well, if you say so. Evelyn lunged forward and grabbed him by the collar of his suit jacket. Before he could react, she shifted her weight and pushed him into the building's brick wall. His head hit it hard, and he slumped down to the ground. She kicked him hard in the temple. He laid on the wet ground motionless, the fire blanket pulled away from his upper body. Sarah was moving before she even realized what she was doing. She charged forward and swung her fist towards her mother's face. The woman was caught off guard, and her head snapped back as the punch landed hard. Sarah didn't get a chance to follow up the blow. Evelyn quickly recovered and jammed her elbow into her daughter's stomach. The air whooshed out of Sarah, and she doubled over. Evelyn got behind her and wrapped her arm around the girl's neck. With the other hand, she pulled the blanket away and tilted Sarah's head up towards the sky. The black sludge splattered against her face as she tried unsuccessfully to struggle against her captor. "None of that now," Evelyn whispered into her ear. "This will only take a minute. Fighting it will just make it harder on you." The thick liquid continued to pour down on Sarah. Evelyn's grip tightened, and she was forced to open her mouth to breathe. The ichor slid down past her lips and into her throat, while also filling her nostrils. She thought that she would choke to death on it. "It's okay," Evelyn said, her voice calm. "Everything is going to be okay." Josh didn't regain consciousness all at once. Instead, he swam in and out of it, his mind barely processing that he was doing so. When he finally did manage to regain his senses, the pain in the side of his head made him instantly regret it. It took him a few moments to open his eyes. It was such a simple act, but for some reason he found it extremely difficult. Eventually, he managed to get his lids to separate, only to find that everything was blurry. He blinked a couple of times, and his vision cleared. He was lying on his side on the ground, rain and black sludge pelting him and soaking through his clothing. Ignoring the growing pain, he moved his hand to partially cover his face. He couldn't remember why, but he was sure that there was some reason that he didn't want the falling liquid to continue striking his face. Standing a dozen feet or so in front of him was Sarah and a woman with the same color hair as her, both of them covered in the black ichor. Alarm bells began to ring in the back of his head, but once again, he couldn't remember why. He felt like he was underwater, with thoughts swimming in and out of his conscious mind. The woman reached into her pocket and took out a key. It was attached to a red keychain by a thin chain. She extended it out in front of her. There was an audible click, and a door appeared out of thin air. Returning the key to her pocket, she turned the door's handle and opened it. It was difficult to see from the angle, but Josh was sure that he saw a long hallway beyond the opening. The woman put her arm around Sarah's shoulders, and they both walked through the doorway. As the door closed, Sarah glanced back at him for a split second. The door slammed shut and disappeared like it had never been there. The memories from the evening came flooding back to him as his head cleared. Fear sent a chill down his spine, not fear for himself, but fear for Sarah's well-being. She had been taken into the lodge, the strange other reality that he didn't really understand. He had to get help. Josh tried to push himself up, but he almost immediately fell back down to the ground. His chin smacked into the turf painfully, making his teeth clack together. He tried again. This time he managed to get up onto his elbows, and from there, he slowly got back onto his feet with an assist from the building wall next to him. He leaned against it while he waited for the sudden dizziness to subside. He realized that he was covered in the black ooze falling from the sky. He wondered if that meant he was going to go crazy like the people that had attacked prom. It didn't matter. There wasn't anything that he could do about it now. The only thing that mattered was getting back to Lamplight Woods to find help for Sarah. He stumbled forward, using the building to help steady himself. He managed to make it to the corner and peered out around it. The parking lot was close, and he could see his car under one of the lampposts. There didn't seem to be anyone else around. Someone nearby screamed. He pulled back around the corner and waited as he strained his ears to listen. The sounds of someone running through the muddy turf drew closer. Those footsteps were quickly joined by others. Steadying himself, he once again looked around the corner. 3 people were chasing a teenager in a suit towards the parking lot. The boy was managing to stay ahead of them, but they were closing the gap. He headed straight towards a white pickup truck at the back of the lot. Josh grimaced as he saw how things were going to play out. His pursuers were too close. There was no way that he was going to make it. Even though that was obvious, he still hoped that he was wrong. The boy reached the pickup and started to open the driver's side door. Before he could get it open far enough to slip inside, the lunatics caught up to him and tackled him to the concrete. He screamed, but those screams were quickly cut off as they beat him to death with their bare hands. From the angle he was at, Josh mercifully couldn't see the boy. He could hear the celebratory cries from his attackers, though, and as he watched, blood splattered the side of the pickup. Josh was shivering, and it wasn't because of the rain. He took a series of deep breaths in a mostly fruitless attempt to calm his nerves. If he didn't want to suffer the same fate as his classmate, he needed to make his move now while the killers were distracted. Taking out his keys, he ran towards his car. He managed to make it without incident. Quickly unlocking the door, he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As he backed out of the space, he saw the 3 crazed people stand up and look in his direction. They were covered in blood and gore, and it flew off of their bodies as they ran towards him. He managed to get the car going in the direction of the parking lot exit by the time they reached him. One of them jumped onto the trunk, while the others smashed their hands against the windows. He gunned the engine, and the car lurched forward, causing the man in the trunk to fall off and land hard on the ground. The other 2 people ran after him for a few seconds, but when it became obvious that they weren't going to catch up to him, they stopped their pursuit and headed back to the high school. The only road leading towards Lamplight Woods ran right through the center of town. As he drove as fast as he dared through downtown Craigsville, he saw that the insanity wasn't just limited to the school. Hundreds of people were rioting in the streets, violently assaulting one another while destroying property and setting fire to buildings. He tried to ignore everything happening around him and focus on where he was headed. He sighed in relief as he left the main part of town and turned onto a long stretch of empty country roads. After a couple of minutes, the rain stopped, and by the time he reached the bridge leading into Lamplight Woods, there was no trace of the black liquid that had fallen from the sky in Craigsville. He looked down at his hands on the steering wheel. Not outside, anyway. Black streaks stained his skin. His exposure to it hadn't triggered anything yet, but that didn't mean that it wouldn't. He returned his eyes to the road. There was no sense in worrying about something he couldn't control. He'd get it washed off as soon as he could. He drove over the bridge and down the poorly lit road that wound through the woods towards town. He was feeling very tired, and it was difficult to concentrate on what he was doing. His head was throbbing in multiple spots. Despite his best efforts, his eyelids started to droop. Ignoring the pain it set off, he shook his head firmly before turning on the air conditioning full blast. He had to stay awake. Reaching the rows of buildings that marked Lamplight Woods' downtown, he followed the road until he came to the turn he was looking for. Tunnel vision was setting in, and he felt numb, like he was observing what was happening instead of living it. He kept telling himself that he was almost there. He just had to keep going a little longer. By the time he reached Forgotten Tales, he could barely control the car. Pulling it into the driveway, he put the car in park with what seemed like far too much effort and made himself get out. Each step felt like he was trying to lift heavy weights as he walked to the porch and up the steps to the front door. He leaned against the door and knocked. When there was no response, he tried the handle, but it was locked. Darkness started to overtake him. Sliding down to the wooden porch boards, he leaned back on the door and closed his eyes. He'd find Sarah's father in a few minutes. He had to rest. Just for a minute. As the late spring night air washed over him, Josh lost consciousness. Michael stared at the computer monitors, unsure of what to say or even think. The hidden hatch in the floor of the Fordham cabin had led to a long hallway with metal-lined walls. At the end of that hallway had been a door that had taken both he and Maggie to open. Beyond it was a large multi-room bunker filled with old computer equipment and enough supplies to make it through the end of the world. It had taken some doing, but he had managed to get the computer up and running, and he had been going through the hundreds, if not thousands of files on it for what seemed like hours. A few minutes earlier, he had discovered that the computer was linked into a much larger system that was spread throughout Lamplight Woods. As far as he could tell, there were 5 total bunkers, each of them located in such a way as to form a pentagon around the town. Each of these locations had hidden cameras, and he had worked out how to access the feed. He was now watching footage from a week ago in one of the other bunkers. The video was in black and white, and it was more than a little grainy, but it clearly showed Sarah and Josh talking to one another while looking over a map. "They know about these places," Michael said, feeling a mixture of worry and aggravation. "They know, and they haven't told me." "Maybe they have a good reason," Maggie answered, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Don't jump to conclusions." He ran a hand over his face. "Yeah, I suppose you're right. I can't imagine what a good reason would be, but I should give them the chance to explain." She looked around the room slowly. "Now that you've had a chance to look through things, any idea what this place is for?" Michael hesitated. "I think my father built this place. This and the other bunkers. They're constructed similar to the underground prison he installed in the backyard at Forgotten Tales. As for the reason, I don't know. There's already a monitoring room at Forgotten Tales itself. That's where I sent Sarah and Josh to when the demon attacked the store. I'm not sure why my father thought he needed places like these off-site." She looked at him closely. "There's something you're not telling me." He shook his head. "No. Well, kind of, I guess, but not purposely. It's more that I'm trying to work my way through something. Hold on a second and I'll show you." Michael began typing on the keyboard. The computer software was ancient, and he hadn't used a DOS system since he was a child. He managed to muddle his way through the text-based menus until he found the one that he was looking for. A few more keystrokes, and they were looking at a crude black and green map of Lamplight Woods. "Those 5 squares are the bunkers," he said. "If you look closely, you'll see that they're all connected by 2 lines. At first I didn't think much of them. Who cares about lines when the things they're attached to are the important things, right? But the more I've been thinking about it, the more that I'm wondering why they're on the map in the first place." "I'm pretty sure I know what those are," Maggie told him. He blinked. "You do?" "Pretty sure, yeah. Out in the passage leading from the cabin to here, I saw that there are 2 round pipes on the ceiling. One was marked for data cable, and the other was marked as electrical cable." Michael frowned. Data cables make sense. The computers in each bunker are networked, and it would take a lot of cable to wire them together. Why power cables, though? I get having to connect into the town's electrical system, but why run them from bunker to bunker instead of wiring each one into the grid independently? She leaned in closer to the screen. Especially since the town is in the center of the bunkers, the power cables should be running from the town itself to each bunker instead of looping all the way around. Maybe the electrical cables are used for something besides keeping the lights on? Maybe. He stretched and yawned. I'm exhausted. What time is it? Maggie glanced at her watch. Just after 7 in the morning. We should get some sleep. Yeah, no sense in hanging around here any longer. Maybe Sarah and Josh can shed some light on this later today. Michael turned off the computer and they left the bunker. Making their way through the tunnel, they reached the ladder and climbed up into the remains of Fordham Cabin. In the growing morning light, it was easier to see the damage that the Stormsmiths had caused. There was even less of the structure left than he had thought. Maggie moved some of the debris over the hatch before stepping back and examining her work. Good enough for now, she said. I'll come back this afternoon and put a lock on it. They made their way through the woods to where they had parked their cars. Maggie leaned on the hood of hers and stretched a kink out of her back. Not bad work for one night, she observed. Not at all, Michael agreed. Hopefully we can get some leads on the others that Bingo let out of their cages soon. Not too soon. A few slow days are just what the doctor ordered. I'm looking forward to... Maggie trailed off as her eyes turned up towards the sky. The blood drained out of her face, and her eyes widened. Michael spun around and looked in the direction she was staring at. The sun had risen over the horizon, but that wasn't what had caught her attention. A huge round black object was moving across the sky. As it moved, the light dimmed and dark shadows stretched across the ground. He was frozen in place as he watched the orb grow closer and closer to the sun until it passed in front of it. They were witnessing an eclipse. The object stopped directly in the middle of the sun. The yellowish-white light still visible around the edges flared for a split second before turning a deep blood red. A streak of the same red light sliced down from the bottom and through the sky to form an elongated triangular shape. The world turned dark with a faint crimson tinge over everything. Michael, what is this? Maggie asked quietly, her voice tight. He didn't answer. He didn't have any answer to give.